Hello everybody and welcome to our second PPIE webinar. I'm Hilary Lindsay, I'm the Chair of CLL Support and I'm delighted to be facilitating this webinar this evening. So I just want to begin by recognising the financial contribution that we've had from the following pharmaceutical companies towards the costs of our webinars. They've had absolutely no input to the content of the programme or the choice of speakers. They provided monies used towards the cost of the webinar licence, administration and to making a professionally edited recording available on our website. Thank you to AbbVie, AstraZeneca, B1 and Lilly. This is our second webinar where we're going to be talking about public and patient involvement and engagement and looking at this in practice. We looked rather at the theory a couple of weeks ago at the first webinar. We have Dr. Nick Martinez-Calais, who is a consultant haematologist at Nottingham, and as it says on here, chair of the UK CLL Support Forum, so a critical role in the CLL community. Dr. Ben Kennedy, a haematology consultant and committee member of Research Ethics Committee for the NHS Health Research Authority, and a long-standing friend of CLL Support. We're just so indebted to you, Ben, for all that you do for us. We've got Jackie Martin talking to us about the perspective of being a patient with CLL who's been involved in PPIE. Jackie's also an associate of CLL Support. Troy is also going to be on the call. He's another person with CLL and trustee of CLL Support. And we have Sean Bowden joining us as well. So Sean's somebody who's had a lot of PPI experience in the wider field, not necessarily in clinical trials, and he's an associate of CLL Support. So that's who we are this evening. And the next slide just sets out the agenda that we're going to go through in the next hour and a half. So setting the scene, and then journey of a mature trial concept, some experiences of PPIE, roles and expectations, both of the clinical team, but also of the PPIE representatives, PPIE involvement in a trial in progress, and then at the end, practicalities, which will very much be next steps about the PPIE register that I'm going to mention in a minute to you. And then at the end, there's a question and answer session. So please do put your questions into the Q&A box as we move through the webinar, and then we can address those at the end. So when we were starting off within CLL Support and wanting to be more proactive in what we were doing in this whole PPIE space, rather than waiting for people to come to us with requests, we wanted to go out there and say, here we are, we want to help. We began by trying to work out what we stood for, and there were 5 of us on the group at the time, and we each worked out what mattered to us most about good patient and public involvement and engagement. Miraculously, the 5 points fit together so well, and we see it as our hand, and we're very much reaching out to the other community, if you like, the clinical community, and saying, this is what we think matters in good PPIE. Please, will you join us from the other side, if you like, and work with us with those values that we've identified. So we're very keen that PPIE should be embedded and costed right from the very beginning of a trial, that it should very much entail a respectful partnership, that it should involve effective communication between everybody and between the people running the trial and the people on the trial. That trials should very much be responding to patient need, so what matters to patients, not necessarily what's the next scientific improvement, because it's not that easy, if you like. There's a whole load of ramifications around any trial and about the impact it might have, the side effects it might have, the conditions under which people get involved in the trial. So it needs to respond to patient need. And we're very, very keen that it should encompass quality of life, which to us is such an important aspect, that it's not just about the treatment, it's about how the treatment then enables you to live your life with the diagnosis of CLL. So we felt those were the 5 matters, and then we moved on a bit more and came up with the idea of, well, let's work out what areas we want to get involved with in this, and we came up with the acronym of STAR. So this immediately gave us incredible credibility amongst the the academic community, we've got an acronym. So this stands for Studies, Trials and Research. And the areas that we're very much involved with, I mean, because we are the CLL body that's patient-led charity, so that's our unique position, if you like. We see us taking a lead in that role. We see us informing our community about opportunities. We see us promoting what matters to our community, to the medical community. We see us connecting with other bodies, with each other, to make a difference. And we see us convening and bringing people together, involving our members so that we can make a difference. And that then leads on to the next slide. And very much this convening, what we've now done is set up our PPIE register. And in fact, I was at a meeting earlier today where we were discussing the very, very early ideas of a new clinical trial. And the people joining the meeting, we'd approached through the register and said, who would like to come along? And so that was a really good example, a very current example of the register in practice, where we're able to respond to requests for input by accessing people on the register. And if you're not on the register already, there's a link here that you can go to, or if you just type CLL Support and star into Google, you'll find that you'll be able to scroll down the page and find where you can link to join the register. Just a few questions to be on the register, and then we'll write out to you with any opportunities that come along our way, whoever wanting to find people to get involved in PPIE. Before I hand over to the next session, though, I do just want to emphasise that PPIE can be a bit close to home at times. So particularly if you're involved in PPIE around CLL. So all the way through, I think people need to look out for themselves and make sure that they're not offering to do anything that they feel uncomfortable about, and recognising that there might be times where they no longer want to be involved in PPIE because it doesn't feel right for them at that time. So a bit of a health warning, if you like, generally about that. But then the final slide before I hand over is just pointing out that when we ask people to join the register, we ask them to say which areas they can get involved in. And there are 3 areas where you can tick the box. You can tick it for all of them if you want. The first one's about discussions around research activity, and we've been doing things around that space recently around fatigue, as I mentioned as an example below. The third area at the top is about responding to pharmaceutical companies who sometimes want input from the patient perspective to help them understand what it's like being part of the CLL community. And we respond to those requests. But the 2 areas that are highlighted are the ones that this webinar and the previous one are very much about. It's about people saying they'd like to get involved in PPIE activities related to CLL or SLL. And the webinars are the example at the bottom of what we're now doing to try and develop that community, help that community develop the knowledge and skills so that you feel that you can volunteer. And we'll be talking more about that at the end of the webinar. What I'd now like to do, if I may, is pass over to Dr. Nick Martinez-Calais, who's going to talk about the journey of a mature trial concept.
Thank you, Hilary, and good night, everyone, for people who's joining and for those who are going to listen to this at a later time point. So I'd like to start by saying that we would hope that after these 2 webinars, you would be, knowledgeable and confident about what is it that PPIE looks like, and you'll be knowledgeable enough to know what you're being asked if a request comes through after today, and you just look into it and say, okay, I know what this is about at least, and I know what roughly what it entails, and I'm happy to go for it, do it or not. However, the training that we're providing now doesn't really stop here. I would say, I think I'm from the CLL Forum point of view, we'll be happy to continue supporting, because I think this is about competency and skill maintenance, and there are many things that we might want to touch in the future, and perhaps with even more practical training, if you will, perhaps using kind of real life examples of experiences of existing PPIE, etc. So kind of in a more of a workshop sort of model. So just as a horizon scanning for what we would expect for this group to evolve, ideally, and be a good player in the research field of CLL. So I'm going to talk to you about, because this is all about trials and research, and that's the core motif of the STAR group. So apologies, is this, if this comes as quite obvious to some of the attendees or the people who's listening to this, but we thought it would be the best. The best time is to show what happens to a study. Where does it come from, and how long does it take? So you can see in this sort of graphical representation that the idea of the trial comes first, and there's a triangle that I call the attrition triangle, which is how much of ideas come to become a protocol of a study, and then how many of those ideas become to be funded in the end for clinical trials. So you can see we're quite active generally, and clinicians and researchers are quite active community in terms of coming up with ideas of things we could do, we would like to do, or we would like to answer. But for various reasons, some of them are not practical, or they're difficult, or they just not so now go. So probably one out of 10 trial ideas is not going to end up being successful for one way or the other. So then once you decided to picking up on the concepts of the last webinar, once you've decided on the clinical question you're asking, and you've decided on how you're going to answer that question in terms of how many patients, what are your methods, and etc., you put that in writing, and you build this document that's called the protocol, which is the key element of a study that will allow you to do that reproduce that study if you wanted to on a later time point or in a different scenario. And there will be kind of the master document, which is quite a long document. Not sure how much have you how many of you have been have seen a trial protocol face to face, but it's quite over few hundred pages document that contains every little detail about how this trial is conducted. So it takes a while, it takes a lot of manpower, a lot of effort to go through this. And then once you have that, then you have to get that and see how do you fund it. And that's where most trials fall down, really, just because the funding is competitive, whichever way you want it. The money is a limited resource, and we cannot really expect to fund all the ideas we have, basically, because it is not possible. So you have to make sure that your idea is answering a relevant question, as we've touched on before, but then that question is relevant for all the players in the study, for the patients, for the pharma companies, or the drug developers, and for the clinicians. And that's where the art of building a good clinical trial comes, because you have to build an idea that is attractive to all the stakeholders. And that's the first sort of input from the patient and the public involvement in the study. So within those funding bodies that are giving money to the clinicians to do studies, within the grant applications, there should be patients saying, this is the idea that best suits the patient's interest, and this is something that is very well taken into account. And also from the point of view of the clinical trial, being a patient representative within the group that is designing the clinical trial, making sure the questions and the protocol is aligned with the patient's interest is going to increase the chance of that trial being funded as well. So as you can see, the patient can be inputting on this from several angles, and actually good patient involvement at all levels will end up being beneficial for the trials and for the patients, because that is going to answer to the specific questions we want to ask. And time is on the bottom there, because it is critical, because you have to constrain that time as much as possible, because if you wait for too long from the time you think about the trial, from the time it starts, which is sometimes can be several months or even a couple of years, then the idea you had, which might have been very good at the time, then in 2 years' time might be completely obsolete. So there's a very time constraint to get things done as quickly as possible, and that's why you will sense this urgency to get these things over the line if you get involved in PPIE, because time's of the essence here, and the medical field evolves so quickly that if you're not on the tip of your toes and moving quickly, you quickly become obsolete. So then once you have a funded idea, so you convince somebody to give you money for the study, which can sometimes be several £1 million, depends on the trial. Then you have to get through the regulatory approval. So then there are two main domains of this. The first one, as you can see there, is the ethical approval. And this is another big aspect into which patients can be involved. So ethical approval is going through the ethics committees that are nationwide, and they approve these protocols. So I think is probably the most developed instance for the PPIE involvement, and it's answering mainly three things for the study. So if you're doing a PPIE for an ethics committee, your role is to say, well, is the risks the patient is assuming proportional to the benefit they're obtaining? Second, is the patient being well informed about what's going to happen to them? And that's basically the informed consent and the patient information sheets and all those documents that need to be reviewed. And we don't expect the patient representative to pick up, methodological, statistical issues or something that is kind of more technical, but actually whether or not, as a patient, is this understandable and lay and palatable to people from various backgrounds? And perhaps that's the biggest difficulty from my point of view of a patient representative, because you have to put yourself in the shoes of any patient, not just a patient that might, and sometimes you risk being biased because you have a certain background or a certain understanding of things. And that the procedures that are happening in this study, as a third item, are they proportional and they're measured, and are they putting the patients at unnecessary risks or not, and are those risks really necessary? Is there other ways we can obtain this information? And the quality is also very important, making sure that the recruitment of the study is distributed along a proportion. Everyone who's got CLL in the UK or in England has possibly equal access to clinical trials, and that should be something that the PPAs can really get involved in. And then secondly, the regulatory approvals. Basically, that's just the regulatory authorities need to make sure that the drugs are being used appropriately, in terms of the license that they currently have, or if they're purely research, when is there enough safety data to go ahead with this trial, or is there enough information about the safety of the drug to be able to use it, and are there safeguards in place to make sure that the safety is looked after, and there are actions taken if there are signals of a potential toxicity or adverse events to the patients, making sure that everyone's got good indemnity and etc., and making sure that the conflicts of interest are well addressed. Essentially, that the resources that the trial is using are lawful and appropriately used. There's also good amount of input here from patient representatives, because although it's slightly more technical, but there's also a role for the patients here. So in this next section, both Jackie and myself wanted to try to share some experiences of PPIE, and we're going to start by sharing a couple of mine, and then hoping that Jackie will give us some of hers. So this is the first one I want to share. This is a study that is ongoing, which is called the Uncover Plus, which is an observational study with the registry data from NHS England. It's led by some brilliant colleagues from the University of Liverpool, and it has been advocating since the beginning, a very strong patient advocate here. And then what happened with this study is that we were having some brainstorming of ideas we thought that were brilliant, that we could access and we could answer with these data that we had from NHS England, and the patient has come here in this instance and completely turned around what we thought we wanted to achieve and we wanted to answer, because they went back to the fundamentals. They were a minute that there isn't really good evidence of the epidemiology of the CLL. How many people do we diagnose a year? How many people are diagnosed on watch and wait? How many people are treated every year? How many? Because the data we got is very fractioned or very fragmented. So why don't we start with that? And it was an eye opener for all the clinicians that were there in the call. It's like, you're absolutely right. It's an excellent example, and I think it's best probable I can think of a good patient representation that's just pause everything and say, wait a minute, let's do things this way. And the second one is the patient representation in the National CAR T-cell panel. Although it's not strictly a clinical study, because this is a national panel that gives approval to patients who are treated or to be treated with this CAR T-cell therapy. Unfortunately, not yet available for CLL for various reasons. So basically, there are certain eligibility criteria that patients need to meet for this to be available for these treatments. This panel is there to check that this eligibility is there. In this panel meeting several times, and I've seen the patient representation, who are very experienced patient representatives who have a global view of these criteria, are being able to change decisions that we thought clinically were very sound, but actually they went back to say, look, we think that from the patient perspective, this is unfair, and we're disadvantaging the patients because the word of the law is very, very precise or very specific about certain aspects of these, and actually that makes the patient a disservice. And some patients have been approved on the basis of the pure opinion and advocacy of the patients here. So another good example of a very positive engagement of patients, which I hope that helps to inspire people to join this. And I think I'm going to give the word now to Jackie, because she's also been a patient representative and a clinical trial patient.
Thank you very much. I thought I'd just show two brief slides just showing what can happen if we don't have good PPIE. And then I thought I'd spend the rest of my amount of time just going through some of the things that I've done in order to illustrate the sort of experiences you could get involved with, really. So good PPIE means that the research projects address the needs and priorities of people with the lived experience of a condition. Not always strictly necessary. You might be asked to get involved in something that isn't to do with CLL, but often it will be to do with something that you have got lived experience of. Hilary mentioned earlier that quality of life is really important, and that includes the quality aspect of PPIE. So to make sure by involving patients and the public improves the design and conduct in order to improve the quality of life for patients. So what can cause a failure of PPIE? Well, obviously no PPIE at any stage, so no patient input whatsoever. Where the patient representative wasn't able to offer the constructive scrutiny that can shine a light on potential issues, signposting problems ahead, or if the concerns that they expressed were not addressed and listened to. That has never, ever been my experience whatsoever. You're invited because they want to hear what you've got to say. They value you as a member, and there's a lot of respect given to the patients. The representative may have been given a task that they really were not able to fulfill, and if you feel that is ever the case, then it is really important that you speak up. Sometimes there is other training available, and you may be assisted in the elements that you've been asked, or mentored in some way, and that's a very good experience. So potential consequences for a trial following a patient of public and patient involvement. Obviously, failure to recruit patients. Patients may not feel that this is a trial that they could get involved with. It might be logistics, it might be the treatment, it could be any one of a number of reasons. But as a patient representative, you're looking at that trial from a patient point of view and thinking, is this something that I could take part in? I could, endorse. Going on from that, if the patients have been recruited, but then the number of tests and this and that and the other are too onerous, patients may feel that treatment isn't, is very difficult or something like that. Patients may decide to drop out of the trial, and of course that is their absolute right at any point. And ultimately, of course, the failure to answer the research question, and that, of course, would be a disaster really for the patients and the scientific and medical communities. And that failure would have a potential impact on future studies that might be planned. It might be financial, people not so keen to back ideas. It could be academic. Academic institutions that sponsor trials might not want to get involved. There's a whole host of ramifications that a failure of a trial, not to mention the expense of it all, really. Moving on from that, I thought I'd just, say a few things about the things that I've been asked to do. So one of the common things I've been asked to do is to read patient information sheets. If you've been in a clinical trial, you'll know that they can be extremely wordy. They can be very technical. They can be scientific. They can be medical. And it's important that for trial protocol, those words are there because they have very precise meanings, and that means that there is no confusion regarding important measurements in inclusion, exclusion criteria, remission definitions, and all sorts of things like that. So that is very important. But patient information sheets, although they're there, it helps to soften them a little bit, and with a little bit of explanation or something like that, so that it doesn't feel too overwhelming and wordy. So often that's not true. Sometimes plain English summaries are produced of the patient information sheets, and that's where a patient representative can also be extremely helpful. I've got a background in haematology clinical trials, and also as a haematology biomedical scientist. So with that background, it makes it slightly easier for me to translate the medical and scientific language into common lay language, if you like, so that it's easily understood by everybody. I sit on the UK Biobank management group, and on that we're sometimes asked to review research proposals. So the biobank is exactly what it says. It's a biobank of frozen cells from quite a lot of different blood cancers, CLL being one of them. Some of these, if you've been in a trial, then sometimes the cells in the blood samples that you've been given, and you will have given permission for this to take place, are stored in the biobank. The value of that is that patients' cells that can be studied over many years. And so those research proposals, it's only a summary of outline summary of the principles, but then members of that group are asked, do you think this is something that is worthwhile and valuable? And we may be asked to prioritise them as well. I sit on a trial management group. I am the PPI rep on, as I say, on a trial management group. We look at reports, essentially. We meet quarterly. We look at reports, safety reports. So we review any adverse incidents. Did people get seriously ill? What happened about it? What were the circumstances? Various things like that. We look at patient recruitment. Is the trial recruiting to target? All trials have targets, time to recruit and, following patients. And if the patients are not being recruited, well, why are they not being recruited? What are the issues there? Is it that we haven't got enough centres open? So we look at the hospital, recruiting hospitals to the trial, and things like that. What are the potential barriers to opening this trial in other hospitals? One trial management group that I sat on was having huge difficulty in recruiting patients, and it was a rare disease. That's difficult, but that makes trials even more important, really, when it's a rare disease. And the patients were being asked to go a long way, often when they were extremely sick and in a very urgent need of treatment. And patients in that situation often don't feel able to travel distances, don't feel mentally sort of capable of having a new team look after them, people they don't know, people that not that they don't trust, but they don't know them enough to trust them yet. And I'm not sure how we were ever going to get over those barriers, but we try to address it by opening as many sites as was feasible. A couple of years ago, I was asked by NICE to get involved in a NICE scientific advice project, which is it's probably not a very, very common thing actually, but it's where companies ask NICE to provide confidential advice early in their development plans for new medicines or devices. The NICE team then engage with the company and advise them on their plans for generating evidence for their project to help them meet the requirements for later evaluation at NICE when the product is brought to market. So they were looking in this instance for a high risk relapsed CLL patient. And I fitted that profile. I've had numerous lines of treatment. And in fact, only earlier in that year, I had a stem cell transplant because there were no other suitable treatments available for me. My role was to provide, as always, is to provide the patient's perspective on their plans, and illustrate the reality and the limitations and the important things, quality of life again, about living with CLL to help them make informed decisions about how they were planning to take this research proposal forward. What would be acceptable to patients? Would there be any barriers to recruiting patients? There were a few things I had to do, but it was over quite a tight time frame. In fact, only about 4 weeks, in fact, from me agreeing to take part and then the conclusion of it. First and importantly for them was I had to sign a confidentiality agreement. So I can't disclose what the project was, what we discussed, who was involved, anything about it whatsoever. I had to read all the documentation, which was quite a lot, scientific, technical, and medical language was involved in that because it was effectively a protocol. And as I described before, those words are important in order to make sure there isn't any misunderstanding about how to interpret information and stuff like that. Again, given my background in haematology and research, I was able to deal with all of that. So then I participated in several Zoom meetings, and at those meetings were the scientific advice team. So there were people from NICE, there were people from the company, there were medical experts, clinical experts, and health economics experts who look at the financial aspects of it all. In this case, there weren't really any statistical expert people there who were looking at numbers and things like that, because this was a very small pilot that they were proposing to do. We had the meetings and they made a report. A report was written to the company, and my final role then was to review and comment on the draft and then the final report. Finally, I'd just like to say PPIE has always been a positive and rewarding experience for me. If you feel you can get involved, I'm sure you would feel the same. And every CLL patient in the country would be indebted to you in some small way for giving up your time and experience in helping to make things better for everybody. Thank you.
So now we're going to ask Dr. Kennedy and Troy to move on to talk about roles and expectations.
Well, hello, everybody, and you're very welcome again. I hope you can hear me okay. And hello, Troy.
Hi, Ben.
So, yeah, good to see you again. We're going to discuss some aspects of roles and expectations. I think on the CLL Support website, there's probably going to be more supportive information and slides as well that will back up these presentations. So I hope that those are there. So anyone who's joining us and going through the website may have picked that up already. I'm not sure. Just very briefly before we start this, I wanted to just speak to what Jackie was saying about a failure of a study. In my view, I don't think that a study would ever fail because of any PPIE input. I think it would be despite PPIE input, and I think any input from a PPIE group is much more likely to lift the study up and help it rather than anything else. So I can't see a circumstance where anyone would be concerned or worried that they might somehow contribute to a study that doesn't sort of add to the sum knowledge. And that's quite rare, I believe, from experience in any case. Yeah. So I mean, Troy, I think you're going to chip in at any stage, but mostly in terms of roles and expectations, we've said this before, the onus is on the researchers to ensure that issues around openness, equality, diversity, integrity and honesty, those are, researchers are held to account for those aspects, and that a study should be as good as it possibly can be, whatever that means. I think we can explore that as well. Researchers they're the ones that are responsible for demonstrating how the PPIE has improved the research, not the PPIE group itself. So, they should be able to say how many people have been involved, what they've done, and how that's changed the research submission at the initial stages. And researchers should interact with PPIE to showcase research questions and provide examples to PPIE members, say what is considered to be like a hot topic perhaps in CLL at the moment, whether it's a scientific question or whether it's the opportunity to use the current treatments or cutting edge therapies in the best possible way. So I think there's a lot of onus on researchers. What do you think, Troy?
So when you said researchers are held to account, it's not the people, it's not the PPIE participants that are holding them to account, or is it something? Who is it that's holding them to account, and what is the benchmark for doing that?
Yeah, no, that's a really, really powerful question. I mean, I think first of all and fundamentally, as doctors, we have a duty of care to our patients, and so there's one is held to account by those standards, and so ultimately there is the GMC, which is provides that framework of what is acceptable or not in terms of individual patient care, and were that ever to fall short within the structure of a study, that an individual doctor, whether you're a co-investigator or a principal investigator, if you're managing an individual patient, then that sanction is there ultimately within the organisation, perhaps within the trust. The research and innovation team, the R&I team, will ensure that processes are in place to report any adverse events, whether they're things that are foreseen, so known side effects, and in some ways, much more importantly, the unknown, the unsuspected side effects. And they need to be reported in a very timely manner, usually within 24 hours, for example, to the data safety groups, the data safety management group, to the sponsor of the study, and failure to do that, could result in any disciplinary action in the trust, for example. There are governance structures that we work with in our workplaces that ensure that there is a framework of quality within the clinical sphere. Within clinical studies, we work within the GCP, good clinical practice, and for drugs themselves within good manufacturing practice. So those are sort of quality frameworks, legislative frameworks within which clinicians will work and within which pharmacists will work, for example, to ensure drugs are stored correctly, or that we ensure that we have our duties to ensure duties of care are appropriately discharged.
There's always a background structure in place to protect the trial, protect the patient, and to make sure that things go smoothly, or as smoothly as they can do for
absolutely.
For
because in a clinical trial, it doesn't mean that they give up any of those statutory rights, and it's built in that we should be protecting the safety, well-being, dignity, and identity of participants all the way through the study. But as you say, that because you're in a clinical trial, it doesn't mean you give up any of those normal patients' rights and processes within a hospital trust, for example. Yeah, no, absolutely clear.
Good. And you said, I think Jackie was really good actually when she was talking about her studies. But you've mentioned ideal study as well over here. In your view, what does an ideal study look like?
Oh gosh. Well, I mean, first of all, we're talking about PPIE.
In 1 minute.
That's a good starter, isn't it? So good PPIE at all stages of the study, so that maybe a clear question that can be asked, an appropriate and relevant question that's developed with a PPIE group to ensure that the purpose of the study is as appropriate and relevant to the group it's treating in the first place. Statistically, there should be the power and the underlying mathematics to be able to answer that question. So you need to have enough people in the study to begin with, and there needs to be sufficient difference. If you've got two arms of a study, you need to be able to detect whether there is a difference between the two different types of therapies. For example, it may not be that kind of study, but frequently there are two or more arms of a study that one wants to compare. It should be easy to recruit to. So that means that language barriers should be addressed, logistics should be straightforward, the burden of procedures kept to a minimum, and there should be a clear risk and benefit with a minimum of inconvenience. And Dr. Martinez was clear on that. It should be well run so that the rights and the safety and the confidentiality, etc., as I've already said, of participants are protected at every turn. And the data should be high quality. So when it's collecting that data, it should be robust, it should be credible, and it should be accurate so that things are collected properly, data is collected properly. That if you have a blood test, that blood is analysed by an accredited laboratory, for example, so that you know that the blood results are accurate and true. And at the end, there should be a clear answer that goes back to the question at the beginning, and the results should then be disseminated appropriately and clearly so that it has the correct influence on whatever it might be, drug licensing, on clinical practice, on clinical guidelines, or on the regulatory bodies, so that they have better evidence to show that particular treatment is effective and should be supported in that population group. So I think those would probably be at least some of the elements of an ideal study. So I hope that's helpful.
Thank you.
So for the PPIE members themselves, we've mentioned it before about bringing a diversity of experience and skills to it without any necessary access to technical knowledge, but the lived experience and being sensible is really what this is all about. And we've spoken before about working in partnership with researchers, so that there is give and take in design study proposals and in the management of a study. Raising awareness with patients, carers at the beginning, for example, in the recruitment process, ensuring that any kind of information that goes out, whether it's web-based or flyers or glossy documents, whatever they have, that these are well written and clear. And even word of mouth is very powerful. When you hear somebody say, "I've been in a trial and it went really well, I'm so glad I did," then that's such a powerful endorsement of the whole clinical research thing. And I think that that's something that people can do, and they can talk about their experience and say how much they've contributed to the process of a clinical study, and be really proud of that, and raise awareness in their own personal circles, and facilitating that awareness raising through organised meetings potentially about what a study is and what it means through. Regional meetings of CLL Support or on the website, for example. In the documentation for the research ethics submission, I think that's something that PPIE members won't be writing themselves, but will influence, and the researchers would populate the IRAS form, which goes to HRA and the REC, to describe the study, describe the trial, and to describe exactly what input was given by the PPIE group. And ultimately, there is also how is data communicated effectively, and that's something that traditionally has been with the researchers. You have the chief investigator or one of the principal investigators standing up sharing data at regional, national, or international meetings, and having data published, the clinical study published in a peer-reviewed journal. And there's no reason why members of a PPIE group could not also be co-investigators in a study. So, for example, just as an example, one of the submissions to the Research Ethics Committee on which I sit, we were looking at a study where there was a PPIE lead and two co-investigators for the study identified within the PPIE group, and they were involved in the trials management, and ultimately would probably have had their names on the results on the papers produced in the journals, which is really very welcome, I think. So that's an example of how individuals could be involved in the studies.
I just want to say that I think that slide's quite clear, and I love the idea of PPIE participants presenting alongside the researchers and talking about their experiences as well as the researchers talk about what they did. I think that would make a really powerful story to whoever is in the audience. Just one thing I'd like to ask on that previous slide, though, was you're talking about feedback and proposals, and I just wanted to ask you, just so I'm aware of the process and other people on the call, do you have any examples of where PPIE participants have fed back on some proposals and or study designs, and it's changed the proposal or design of the study?
I think that's something that's happening more and more, for example. But let's say, just in general principles, at the CLL clinical trials group meeting that we hold, where there is a detailed discussion about ideas of what is important, what our priorities are, clinically, how we should address the next UK-based clinical trial for CLL, a big national study like the FLAIR trial, for example. And there is already good representation from CLL Support at that meeting, and I think that will get stronger in time, and those voices are being heard around that table at the very early stages of the conception of a study. So I think that's a really powerful example to reassure people with CLL in UK, where a study is being designed to meet as far as possible the unmet needs of patient groups, with those priorities being at least influenced significantly by CLL Support and the PPIE representation at that. And I think sort of going forward, there would, one would anticipate and envisage a very strong PPIE group drawn from this cohort that would be involved at every step of that study over a period of many years. So I think there are elements of those groups, elements of those stages where people can influence. So not just the initial designs and setting priorities, but looking at the participant-facing documentation. So we're going to talk about participant information sheets and the key points on those, and the informed consent as well, and things that fall out of that. But also trials management groups. And I think it's worth speaking briefly about trials management group, because it sounds like potentially onerous or difficult job, and I don't think these would be, but it's worth going back to what Hilary was saying about not everything is for everybody, and there would be data examined and discussed at trial management groups around side effects, adverse events, and those are technical words to describe human suffering at the end of the day, about what can happen to participants, to people, if they have problems because of therapy or problems because of the illness as a result. And let's be clear that an adverse event is not just a side effect of a treatment. It could also be that from the very moment that a participant agrees and gives informed consent for the study, it's almost anything that happens thereafter. So they could have a cold, and they could have had a cold anyway. They could catch flu, and they would have had flu anyway. They could fall over and stub their toe, okay, or break your wrist or something. But all of those would still be captured as adverse events. Okay, so from the very moment of consent until the very last minute of participation in a study, anything that happens is captured as an adverse event. So the important things are the unsuspected events or the serious adverse events, and they can be anything from needing to come into hospital or even fatalities. And that's a challenge. Right? That's a challenge. It has its psychological and emotional burden, and that's not necessarily for everybody. So maintaining that level of objectivity is something that is, I suppose, a special skill and requirement. But nonetheless, I think that there are many opportunities to be involved at all stages, whether it's just at the beginning. We talked about the timescales of a study, saying that sometimes these things will go over several years. Somebody might want to be involved at the start, but not don't envisage that they'll really want to do it 5 years later. Or they might get involved toward the end and may have a natural gift for communication and want to be part of that, for example, want to be part of the dissemination and the plain English summaries. So lots of stages to get involved. So shall I move on and we'll talk about that?
Yeah, let's move on. So
go back one slide. We're jumping the gun. Here we go. PS. Clear, comprehensive, plain English. There shouldn't be any abbreviations, acronyms, or other jargon there. So one of the roles of the PPIE group is really to sort of work through a bit of a checklist, really. The information sheet should say, why? Why are you being approached for this study? And it'll be because you satisfy the inclusion criteria. You've got, for example, you've got CLL that needs treating. And that could be why we're approaching you. The aims and the purpose of the study should be laid out. All the ins and outs, how long it's going to go on for, how many visits, where are you going to go, what's going to happen to you at those visits. In other words, blood tests, scans, x-rays. There might be a bone marrow test, for example. So all those things, they need to be laid out and clearly described. The risks and benefits need to be described as well, particularly the risks, because when you go into a clinical study, you don't always know if there is going to be a benefit. Okay, so one has to be in a certain position of equipoise going into a study. And if it's obvious that arm A is significantly better than arm B, it's quite difficult to support that study as a researcher, not even as a participant. How could we put forward a study where it's obvious that something is better than something else? There needs to be balance in the study so that as doctors, we're happy to sort of say to support it, and as a PPIE group, that you'd be happy to endorse it in many ways.
This sheet is given out to all participants as they take part.
This is to ensure that you know all the ins and outs before deciding, so that you can actually give your informed consent.
Excellent.
And when it comes to, and it should have a number of other things, how to contact, complain. So lots of specific points, how data is collected and where it's stored, how secure it all is. The informed consent form is, to my view, really a key document, in many ways the key document. It's the pivotal moment whereby if a participant feels that they've had the opportunity to weigh everything up, make up their minds about it, they've had the opportunity to ask questions, they've talked it through with family and friends, and they're making a voluntary decision to take part, and they know what they're getting into. So that is, I think, the pivotal moment in all of this. Has everything been explained adequately and clearly? And weighing up and asking questions. Have the alternatives been explained? You may be aware of a landmark law case in the UK, 2015, Montgomery versus Lanarkshire. And this was a pivotal law case saying that clinicians have got a duty to explain and demonstrate risks and side effects, not to the level that they themselves would think are significant, but a reasonable body of participants would feel is significant. So it has to be framed in terms of what a body of normal people would think of as being a significant side effect. So Montgomery versus Lanarkshire, really, really important case law. And it's one of those check things, if you like, that you were asking about, Troy. Are we explaining to sufficient level of detail what the risks are?
This is just, when I say just, this is one of the other points. This is a bit more structure to protect the patient and make sure that everything's on the right track for them before they go into a clinical trial proper.
Yeah, absolutely. And usually put your initials on in separate boxes. So one will have several different paragraphs about data, about how personal data is managed, who's going to be informed, who can look at your clinical information, and making sure that people are aware of all of that. So an informed consent form is often about how is confidentiality protected as much as anything else. So that's something that is not always familiar before you go into this process.
We can now hand over to Nick.
This part of the webinar was there to say, because we've been talking about the patient information sheet, the ethics committee, the requirements for the trial that's being developed, and how can the patients and the public get involved in it, and then this is the sort of the next step of the way of the journey of a study, which is already open, recruiting patients, following up patients, and how can the people be involved in this phase of the study. And they're still very important for the PPIE representatives to still be involved in this phase and help with them. So there are two essentially big groups or sort of forums where this can happen. So the first one on the top is a trial management group, and as a day-to-day, as Jackie was alluding to, sort of regular meeting with all the trial stakeholders, the clinicians, the statisticians, the administrative people that are running the study, and the patients. And basically, the role of you have to think about a clinical trial as a project. So as a business project in a way, in the sense that it has a budget. And it has a goal that needs to be delivered, and that needs to be delivered within time, within budget, and complying with all the regulations and all the things that need to happen for the clinical trial to be successful. So good quality of the data that's been recollected, and making sure that the clinicians are doing the right things, including the patients that are right for the study, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So basically, what do they look in the trial management group is day-to-day sort of reports about findings, how the trial is doing financially, how the recruitment is doing, how the sites are being opened, have there been any problems with the drugs, how are we doing the sample management, are we collecting the samples all right, the samples getting where they need to get, and are the analysis being done correctly, and then are we collecting the data for the study well. And then there's a post management when the trial's finalized, the trial management group continues to oversight the dissemination of the results of that study, and that is also very critical. At this point, the patient representation is very critical to ensure that there is a feedback to the patients of the study in lay terms about what the benefits of the study were. Did we actually manage to answer our question or not? And what is the benefit that was found on the study going to represent for the CLL community? So that's one. And the other one is the Safety Monitoring Committee, which is an independent group from this study. And that's there to monitor that the trial is conducted safely, and to recommend independently of the trial management group whether or not there are adverse events that need attention and maybe modifications to this study if there are potentially serious and detrimental to the patient. So they're safeguarding the welfare of the patients that are in that study. They sometimes are there to decide. So some studies are taken stepwise because they want to recruit a few patients and make sure that these first few patients are safe before they move on to the next step, and then the next step, and then the next step, and that sort of is, and then also unexpected findings. So what happened? So the Safety Monitoring Committee was critical on the COVID, because then suddenly COVID came, and every trial had to do some sort of adjustment to the COVID situation. Really, do we actually stop recruiting? What happens to the patients who are? And that's just the best example, probably, of a curveball that's thrown into a study that it needs to immediately adapt. And the safety monitoring committee is there to tell us whether we're safe to continue with the treatment or not, and what are the changes to that, for example. So two groups in which patients are critical, central, and whose voice is very, very, very well heard. Yeah,
thank you, Nick and Jackie. And we can then just go on to the next slide, where we're going to talk about the next steps with the PPIE register that we've set up. And it's very early days. I mean, since the last call a couple of weeks ago, we've been dealing with 2 or 3 requests for PPIE input, so it's happening all the time. What we have already done, we've got resources on the CLL Support website. What we've also decided to do, and this is partly following comments at the last webinar and our discussions since, about how do we provide support to people that are getting involved in PPIE activities. And so what we're going to do is just have a quarterly chat on Zoom. So not a webinar, but a Zoom call, where anybody that's on the register that wants to can come along, and we can talk about anything that we want to. And we can talk about ideas such as what resources there are that we can point people towards, or we can be pointed towards. We're all learning. We can talk about possible training. And there's already been a question tonight about would it be possible to write up some case studies of effective PPIE and submit them to the Journal of Research Involvement and Engagement? And yes, we certainly can, and we wouldn't have thought of that idea unless we'd had the suggestion made on this call tonight. So this is very much evolving, and we're all helping to make it grow. So that is definitely something that we'll be looking at, so that people that do get involved have got a point of reference. One of the questions in the last webinar was sort of asking how does Jackie inspire everybody else, because she's so brilliant, and is there a group that she's part of? And I think this is part of the reason why we're wanting to have a group that we can all take part in, so that we're looking after each other. And then in order to do that, we're very dependent with the links that we have with the UK CLL Forum and the study group.
I think that that input that you and your colleagues have had, I don't know how you found it, but I think it's really pivotal in influencing those clinical ideas. And when we sit around the table, I can see how the thought processes of my colleagues are really evolving because of what you and your colleagues say around the priorities of what people with CLL and how you represent them are being articulated at those meetings. It's really powerful and very positive. And so, going forward, having PPIE for specific research is an amazing thing. From the rec point of view, as long as there's more than one person involved, I think that would be too much of a burden. There's usually fairly small groups. I wasn't sure what you thought in terms of numbers for any particular study, maybe sort of 4, 5, 6, something like that.
It just depends on the particular request that comes in, and then also on the level of people that respond to the request. So it says at the top line here about matching demand and supply. So I don't think there's any perfect response. Nick, did you want to come in there?
On Ben's mention about numbers, because we've been giving examples of patient representation in which there is a single person representing patients on a study, and I think this is a paradigm that we're probably challenged to change, really, because there's no reason why there has to be a single patient representative for any study, and actually being a few patients into each of these scenarios where there can be PPA input, I think can only improve that process, because then whoever is there will feel that there's some level of support and accompaniment by the other fellow patients, etc. And it's sometimes for a single patient it's a bit daunting to be facing the whole of the rest of the community. So sometimes the more the merrier, and I think that helps to build a bit of a stronger voice. So encouraging people to come forward. And don't discourage if there's already somebody doing it, because I think we can punch people to do it effectively.
I think we should at least be working in pairs.
I agree.
So, yeah.
And from the rep point, it would be really unusual to just have one person on a study, and quite frequently it will be a group of people, and even with their partners or carers. So it can be broadened out.
So what we've also been doing, just to finish off this slide before we come on to our Q&A, is we have been trying to respond very promptly to requests for input. I think we're learning that trials take a long time, but whenever we're asked to do anything, we're doing our best to respond as quickly as possible. And I think that's then encouraging more people to come back to us. And we're looking at sharing our achievements and experiences. So the publication idea mentioned earlier was very helpful. And ask you to also, all of you on the call, to be spreading the word about any opportunities that there might be.